Hi, AP Psychology. This is Mrs. Parslow, and these are your encoding notes. In class, I said that I was going to start with where we left off in class, but I decided just to go through all of them, just in case you missed something or you wanted to look at something again, it would all be here for you. So these are our encoding notes. So first, here are our essential questions and our learning targets. So the first thing we looked at was how we encode, and that was automatically. This means that it happens without us even being aware that it's happening. It just does. The things that go through automatic processing are about space, where we are, about time, and frequency. So for example, in class I said, if you saw someone earlier in the day and you saw them again later in the day, you would remember seeing them twice that day, even though you didn't try to remember that at the time. The second thing here is parallel processing. This is where I talked about our brain is able to process a lot of different types of information all at one time. But the majority of this is going to look at effortful processing. This is processing where the encoding requires us to put in some effort. So here's a good way. If you look here, it says effort. Think of effortful, actually having to do something with the information. Another way of saying this is through rehearsal or consciously repeating information in different ways. And really when we look at all of these different ways to encode, it's all different ways to actually rehearse the information. And then last on here, I talked about how much we remember depends on how much time we spend learning, and how to be most effective, that even when we feel like we have information down, we should look at it again, just to make sure that that really is moving into long-term memory. And that's called, you see right here, overlearning. Okay, so the first strategy we looked at was chunking. That was putting information into groups. So I talked about, you see the phone number there, or the set of dates, where if we don't chunk them, they just look like a list of random numbers. But once we chunk them, like we did here, into these three groups, or down here into the dates, they become much easier to recognize and remember. So the first is chunking. The second strategy, and I said this is one of the most important, is the idea of distributed practice. So the spacing effect is spreading out your studying. So instead of cramming all of your studying into, just before the test, half an hour or 30 minutes, an hour, however much you would do, instead you would spread that out over several days. And research shows that a person's long-term retention is better if they do use the spacing effect rather than if you cram it all in one night. So really, if the purpose of this class is to help you to pass the AP test, to get the best bang for your buck so you don't feel like you're wasting your time studying, is by using the spacing effect. The next one on here is the testing effect. This is one of my favorites. And this is the idea that forcing you to retrieve your information either through a test that I give you, whether through its self-assessment that you're doing on your own at home, whether having someone quiz you, taking the quizzes that are in the study guide, any of those things help you to actually learn the information. So instead of thinking of testing just as seeing what you already know, you need to think of it as a way to help you learn. So that's the testing effect. Next are the ideas of mnemonics. So a mnemonic is any sort of memory aid. The most effective ones include things like vivid imagery or other types of organizational devices. So that's what you'll see here to the right with the idea of the peg words. So peg words, it's the set of 10 words that have a number and then something associated with them. So we have 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, and so forth. And what you would do is associate each of those words with whatever it is you're trying to remember. So in class, I talked about how, let's say you had a grocery list and the first item was milk. You might think of a bun and associate it with milk. So I might imagine a bun floating in a glass of milk. And usually the imagery, the weirder it is or the more strange it is, the more likely it is you are to remember it. The next mnemonic strategy, this is one that you've probably seen since elementary school, is the first letter technique. So this is useful when you're trying to remember an order of items. So you would take the first letter of each word and form a new word or sentence that's easier for you to remember. So some examples I have here to remember the Directions is never eat shredded wheat. Some of you may have learned never eat soggy waffles. So you're taking just the first letter of each of these and associating it with what you need to remember. Same thing down here with the colors of the rainbow. So you remember the first letters, the Roy G. Biv, to know that they stand for all the different colors of the rainbow. So the first letter technique. Next strategy is called loci. This is also a mnemonic that relies on spatial relationships. Typically people associate it with a certain place that they're very familiar with. Oftentimes I hear it associated with the house, somewhere that you know very well. So first period, you already heard the story, so I apologize, but third period hasn't had it, so I'm going to tell you the story. So let's say I wanted to remember this grocery list I had here. So I want you to imagine that you're at home, and I'm going to walk you through your house. So here you go, here's your story. So if you are starting in your kitchen and you look on your kitchen counter, you see your toaster and you see honey flowing out of your toaster. Then you turn over to the kitchen table and you see a huge Saint Bernard eating their dog food on the kitchen table. You decide to walk into the living room and you're barefoot and you start walking on the carpet and you notice that you have sugar granules all stuck to your feet. You sit on the couch, and behind the pillows of the couch are oranges. From there, you look into the fireplace and you see ice cream melting in the fireplace. You walk into a neighboring room, you sit down at your piano, you attempt to start to play, but you notice that all the keys are stuck with peanut butter. You decide to go upstairs, and you notice on all of the stairs is a piece of bread as you walk up the stairs. So it's bread, 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 all the way up the stairs. You go into the bathroom and you notice in the bathtub it's filled with water, and in there are pork chops floating in the bathtub. You come out to your dresser and you see milk spilled all over your dresser. Finally, you decide to lay down, you pull back your sheets, you lay down on your bed, and underneath you, you have potato chips crunching underneath you. So now if you were to walk your way back through the story, you should remember each of those items, and we'll play around with this a little bit tomorrow in class. So that's loci. Another one, mnemonic, is a substitution technique. This is where letters are used to replace numbers. A lot of times we'll see this with phone numbers. Businesses often use words that are easier to remember than random numbers. So for example, this was a business that was advertised a few years ago. Instead of saying, 1-800, whatever the numbers are, they just said get thin because people would be more likely to remember that. Keyword method. This is another really effective method. This is where you think of a word that sounds like all or part of the word to remember, and then you create a scenario involving that word and the definition. So let me show you some examples of that. So these are all parts of the brain that we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to use this one up here. So one of the terms that we're going to be learning about is Broca's area. Broca's area is a part of the brain that actually directs your muscles in your mouth to be able to speak. So for this, the mental picture, the one it talks about here, there we go, sorry about that. Here is, imagine breaking a talking doll, and if it gets broken, sounds kind of like Broca, it won't talk anymore, which is what Broca's area does. It's about speech. Another way that I remember it is if you know Spanish, you know Broca sounds kind of like boca. Boca means mouth, so I know it's involved with the muscles of the mouth. So you can look at all of these and see the different examples. So it's taking a key word with the meaning and creating a mental picture for it. The last thing that I want to talk about is levels of processing. The second to last. There's two different levels of processing. There's shallow processing and there's deep processing. And the more that you can learn information using deep processing, the better off you'll be. So let me give you some examples of each. Shallow processing is encoding on just a basic level on the structure or the appearance of words. If you think back to the activity that we did on Friday, where some of you had the directions that said create a mental picture, and some of you had the directions that said think about how easy or hard it is to pronounce. The pronunciation one is shallow processing. It's just basing on a word's letters or a word's sounds. Think about if you're doing your reading, you're just kind of skimming over, that's shallow processing. Where on the other hand, if we look at deep processing, that's called coding semantically. Semantically means looking at the meaning of the words. This is a big one. You might want to underline or highlight that. So semantically means encoding based on the meaning of the words, and that tends to yield the best results. So anytime like the keywords method, that's a really great way. Another way is the self-reference effect. So finding personal meaning in what you're studying, asking yourself the question, how does this relate to me? If you're able to use that word or that term or concept and relate it to your own life, that's the self-reference effect, and that's a form of deep processing. So the more often you're able to do that, the more likely you are to be able to remember it. So think about as you're going through your note cards, if you can relate each of those words to your own life or give your own personal example, that's deep processing, and that's the best way to encode information. So one last thing, levels of processing, are they shallow or deep? So here's 3 different ways to encode. First is visual, the second is acoustic, and the third is semantic. So visual encoding is the encoding of a picture image. And this is a little bit misleading if we look at this compared with this. If all you look at is just like the actual word structure, visual encoding is not very effective. However, a way we can move that to deep processing, and that's not written here, is if you think of a personal mental image, like the ones that you created as we were walking through your house, or if you think of a personal example and you get that picture in your head, that's more deep processing. Next, acoustic encoding. So if we're looking at sounds or rhymes, those are more of a shallow processing, but again, if you can relate it to your own life using the self-reference effect, then it would move more towards deep processing. And like I just said, semantic encoding, looking at the meaning of the words, relating it to your own life, thinking about how you can put this in your own words, that is the best way. And really the best memory comes from using multiple forms of encoding. So having some sort of visual, thinking about the sounds or the rhymes, and relating it to your own life, you're going to see, like you see on this chart, that's really the best way to learn the information. So it's my hope that as you're studying for your vocab quiz and your test this week, that you put some of these things into practice. I would encourage you to try something new. My favorites, again, is spreading out your study, use the testing effect to your advantage, do some self-quizzes, and use the self-reference effect. Think about how it relates to your own life, and I think you'll see that your test scores and your quiz scores will go up. Have a great night. See you tomorrow.